My birthday is October 14th. This year, I turned 63. By 11 in the morning, not one member of my family had called. Not Lucas, not Nicole, not Emma, not Daniel, not a text, not a message, not a notification of any kind. I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee, and I looked at my phone. Quiet. I thought, this is interesting. Not because it hurt. It did hurt. I will not pretend otherwise. But interesting because 3 weeks earlier, I had signed a document. A document that Patricia had prepared. A document that listed 47 names. 47 people who would one day receive something from me. Something significant. Something that required careful thought and careful drafting and 2 full afternoons in Patricia's office. 47 names. Lucas was on that list. Nicole was not. Emma was on that list. Daniel was on that list. 43 other people were on that list. People who had shown up. Quietly. Consistently. Without being asked. At 11:14, my phone rang. Not Lucas. Not Nicole. Patricia. She said, "Happy birthday, Eleanor. The letters went out this morning." I said, "All 47?" She said, "All 47." I said, "Good." I looked at my quiet phone. I thought, let's see who calls first. My name is Eleanor Brooks, 63 years old today, Connecticut, retired teacher, widow. Let me tell you about the document first. 6 weeks ago, I had a conversation with Margaret. Our quarterly review, numbers, accounts, the ordinary architecture of a life managed carefully over many decades. At the end of the meeting, Margaret put down her pen and said something she had not said in 16 years of working together. She said, "Eleanor, have you thought seriously about what happens to all of this?" I said, "I have a will." She said, "I know you have a will. I mean, have you thought about it seriously? Not just the legal mechanism, the actual question of who receives what and why." I looked at her. She said, "You have significant assets. The house, the lake house, the investment accounts, the pension, a life insurance policy that has been quietly compounding for 9 years since Richard died. You have built something substantial, and right now it is directed toward," she paused, "toward the default." I said, "The default being Lucas." She said, "Lucas, and by extension Nicole, yes." I sat with that. The default. I had written a will years ago. Standard. The house and assets to Lucas. Simple. Clean. The kind of will a person writes when their life has one clear trajectory and they have not yet looked carefully at where that trajectory is pointing. I had not looked carefully in some time. I said, "Give me 2 weeks." I drove home. I sat in the garden for a long time. I thought about the past 3 years. I thought about the dinner where Nicole announced she was moving into my house. I thought about the bedroom dismantled while I was in hospital. I thought about the Christmas toast where my generosity was called a problem. I thought about $48,000 borrowed in my name. I thought about a lake house nearly sold without a conversation. I thought about a seating chart that put me behind a pillar near the kitchen door. I thought about all of it. And then I thought about the other people. The 47 other people. Let me tell you about some of them. Robert from Vermont, my half-brother. Found him 3 years ago through the most improbable chain of circumstances. He drove 6 hours to help Lucas rebuild a porch. He sends me a letter, a physical letter, every month. Miriam from Maine, my half-sister, calls every Sunday at 4 o'clock without exception. Dr. Reeves, my cardiologist, has been honest with me for 4 years when honesty was harder than reassurance. Margaret herself, 16 years of quarterly meetings, 16 years of telling me the truth about my finances, even when the truth was inconvenient. The Thursday hospice coordinator who schedules my shifts and who sent flowers when I was in hospital with a card that said simply, "We miss you on Thursdays." A former student, now 34 years old, who sends me a card every September on the first day of school because she said I was the reason she became a teacher. Linda Marsh, who trimmed my lavender with the care of someone who understands that a garden is not decoration, who has texted me every Tuesday morning since the week she stayed in my guest room. 47 people. 47 people who had shown up, in small ways and large ones, consistently, without being asked, without knowing there was anything to show up for. I called Patricia. I said, I want to rewrite the will. Completely. I need 2 full afternoons. Patricia said, when? I said, this week. We spent 2 afternoons rewriting everything. The house on Birchwood Lane. To Lucas, he is my son. The house is his. That did not change. The lake house. To Emma, with a right of first refusal already registered to the family from Boston. The investment accounts, divided. Carefully, thoughtfully, with specific reasons documented for each allocation. The pension remainder, divided between Robert and Miriam. And then the charitable bequests, 17 of them, to organizations and institutions and specific individuals who had been present in my life in ways that deserved acknowledgement. 47 names total, each one receiving a letter on my birthday. Not because they were expecting anything, because they had been present when presence was not required. I signed the document 3 weeks ago. Patricia said, when do you want the letters sent? I said, my birthday, October 14th. She said, that is a specific choice. I said, yes. She said, any particular reason? I said, because on my birthday I will know who calls, and I want the letters to go out on the same morning, so I can hold both things at once and understand clearly what they mean. Patricia looked at me for a moment. She said, you are the most deliberate person I have ever represented. I said, I had a good teacher. His name was Richard. If you have ever looked at the people in your life and asked yourself who actually shows up, stay with me. Because what happened after those letters went out is something worth hearing. Subscribe and hit the bell. I post every week. By noon, my phone had received 4 calls, none from my immediate family. The first was from Robert. He called at 11:47. Robert said, Eleanor, happy birthday! I received your letter this morning. I said, good morning, Robert. Robert said, I don't... He stopped. He started again. Eleanor, I don't know what to say. I said, you don't have to say anything. Robert said, the lake house. You are leaving me. You are leaving Miriam and me. I said, the pension remainder, yes. Robert said, why? I said, because you drove 6 hours to build a porch with my son, and you send me a letter every month and you never asked for anything. Those are 3 good reasons. He was quiet for a moment. Robert said, I didn't know about any of this. I never expected. I said, I know, that is precisely why. He said, Miriam is going to... I said, I know. Tell her I said Happy Tuesday. He laughed. We spoke for 20 minutes. The second call was from Emma, 11:53. Emma said, Grandma, happy birthday. I love you and She stopped. I just opened something from your attorney and I am sitting on the floor of my kitchen. I said, get up off the floor, Emma. Emma said, the lake house. I said, yes. Emma said, Grandma. I said, Emma, that lake house has your father learning to swim in it, and your grandfather saying, this is it. It should belong to someone who understands what it is. You understand what it is. Emma said, I understand completely. I said, I know you do, that is why. She said, Ryan is going to... I said, tell Ryan there is a dock that needs some repair, and I expect him to handle it. She laughed, the full, real laugh. We spoke for 30 minutes. The third call was from Linda Marsh, 12:04. Linda said, Eleanor, happy birthday! I received the letter. I said, good morning, Linda. Linda said, the garden fund. You are leaving a specific allocation for garden maintenance at Birchwood Lane. I said, yes. with the instruction that whoever receives the house maintains the lavender along the back fence. Linda said, "You specified the lavender." I said, "You trimmed it with the care of someone who understood it. I wanted to make sure it was in the record." Linda said, "Gerald would have." I said, "I know. Tell him I said so." She was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone communicating with a person who is not there. Then she said, "He heard you." I said, "Good." The fourth call was from Margaret, 12:22. Margaret said, "Eleanor, happy birthday. I received the letter and I want to say—" She stopped. She is not a woman who stops. She paused and then she said, "I have been doing this work for 31 years. I have never received a letter like this from a client." I said, "You told me the truth for 16 years. That has a value that is not in most accounting systems." Margaret said, "The bequest is—" I said, "What it is worth." "Yes, Margaret. You kept me from making 3 significant financial errors in 16 years. Each of those errors had a number. The bequest reflects the number." She said, "You calculated it." I said, "I am 63 years old, and I have been careful with money for 40 years. Of course I calculated it." She almost laughed. My phone continued to ring through the afternoon. The hospice coordinator at 12:41, the former student at 1:15, a neighbor who had shoveled my driveway every winter for 11 years without being asked at 2:03. Each call the same in its essential quality. Surprise, gratitude, the particular emotion of a person who has received something they did not know was possible because they had never considered that what they were doing had been noticed. It had all been noticed. Every letter, every Tuesday text, every shoveled driveway, every honest quarterly meeting, every phone call that came simply because it was Sunday and 4 o'clock. I had noticed all of it. I had written it down. I had put it in a document. At 4:17 in the afternoon, my phone rang. Lucas. 4 hours and 17 minutes after 11 in the morning. I answered. Lucas said, "Mom, happy birthday. I'm sorry I didn't call earlier. The day got away from me." "The day got away from me," I said. "Thank you, Lucas." He said, "Did you have a good day?" I said, "I had an interesting day." He said, "Interesting how?" I said, "I received several phone calls this morning from people who wanted to wish me a happy birthday." He said, "Good. That's good, Mom." I said, "Yes, it was." He said, "Nicole says happy birthday. She meant to call." I said, "Tell Nicole thank you." He said, "We'll take you for dinner this weekend, wherever you want to go." I said, "That sounds lovely." He said, "Everything okay?" I said, "Yes, everything is exactly as it should be." He said, "Okay, good. Talk soon, Mom." I said, "Talk soon, Lucas." I ended the call. I sat at my kitchen table. I looked at my phone. 43 people had called or written by 4:17 in the afternoon. My son had called at 4:17. My daughter-in-law had not called at all. Both of those things were information. I had put them in the document, too. 3 weeks ago, before the birthday, before the silence, before the 4:17 call, I had already known what the birthday would look like. I had written the document accordingly. If you have ever spent a birthday realizing who was absent and understanding exactly what that absence meant, leave me a comment. Tell me what you did with that understanding. I read every single one. Lucas called again on Saturday. He said, "Dinner tonight, 6:30, the Italian place you like on Elm Street." I said, "I'll be there." He said, "Nicole is coming, and Emma and Ryan." I said, "Good." He said, "Emma has been—" He paused. He said, "Emma called me yesterday. She was emotional. She said something about a letter from your attorney." I said, "Yes." He said, "Mom, what letter?" I said, "I'll explain at dinner." He said, "Is everything okay?" I said, "Everything is as it should be. 6:30, I'll see you then." I arrived at 6:25. Emma and Ryan were already there. Emma stood up when she saw me and hugged me for a long time without saying anything. Ryan shook my hand with both of his. Lucas and Nicole arrived at 6:32. Nicole said, "Happy birthday, Eleanor. Sorry I didn't call on Thursday." I said, "Thank you for coming tonight." We sat down, we ordered. Lucas waited until the wine arrived. Then he said, "Mom, the letter. What letter did Emma receive?" Emma looked at me. I looked at Lucas. I said, "I rewrote my will 6 weeks ago." Silence. Lucas said, "Rewrote it?" I said, "Completely, yes." He said, "Without telling me." I said, "It is my will, Lucas. It does not require your prior knowledge." He said, "I understand that. When you say completely." I said, "The house on Birchwood Lane is still yours." He exhaled. I said, "The lake house goes to Emma." Emma looked at her plate. Ryan put his hand over hers. Lucas said, "The lake house." I said, "Yes." He said, I assumed." I said, "I know what you assumed. You also assumed you could sell it 6 weeks ago. That assumption was incorrect. The will reflects the corrected understanding." Nicole said nothing. She was looking at the breadbasket with the focused attention of someone who has decided that the breadbasket is the safest place to look. Lucas said, "What else?" I said, "The investment accounts are divided among 47 people." Lucas said, 47. I said, 47. You are among them. So are Emma and Daniel and Robert and Miriam and several other people who have been present in my life in ways that warranted acknowledgement. Lucas said, 47 people received letters on your birthday. I said, "Yes." He said, "That is why you were getting calls all day." I said, "Yes." He said, "I called at 4:17. I said, "Yes." He said it quietly, not as an accusation, as a statement of fact that he was sitting with. He said, "I was number 43. I said, "Approximately, yes." He said, "Mom, was this a message?" I looked at my son. I said, "The will is a legal document. It reflects my considered understanding of the people who have been present in my life and the value of that presence. It is not a message. It is a record." He said, "A record of who called?" I said, "A record I completed 3 weeks before your birthday. The calls confirmed the record. They did not create it." He sat with that. Nicole said, "Eleanor." I looked at her. Nicole said, "Am I in the document?" I said, "No." She said, "Because of—" I said, "Nicole, the document reflects presence. Consistent, genuine, unrequested presence over time. I documented what I observed. I was accurate." She said, "I see." 2 words, the same 2 words Judith had used when she read the house policy document. The 2 words of a woman who has understood something completely and is deciding what to do with the understanding. I said, "Nicole, I want to say something directly. This document is not punishment. It is not designed to hurt you. It is designed to reflect reality accurately. If the reality it reflects is uncomfortable, that is information worth having." She said, "Yes, it is." Lucas said, "What would it take?" He stopped. He started again. "Is the document? Can it be changed?" I said, "Yes. I review it annually, with Margaret and Patricia. What is in it next year depends on what the year contains." Lucas said, "You review it annually." I said, "Yes." He said, "So it is a—" He paused. He said, "It is a living document." I said, "Everything worth having is living, yes." Emma said, "Grandma." I looked at her. Emma said, "The lake house. I want you to know that I understand what you gave me, not the property, what you gave me." I said, "Tell me what I gave you." Emma said, "The place where Grandpa said this is it. The place where Dad learned to swim. The place where you go every August because August at the lake is yours." I said, "Yes." Emma said, "I will take care of it." I said, "I know you will." Emma said, "And the lavender fence instruction for the garden?" I said, "Linda Marsh. She is in the document with a garden maintenance allocation and a specific note about the lavender." Emma said, "I know Linda. She is lovely." I said, "She trims things carefully. That matters." The dinner continued. The food was good. The Italian place on Elm Street is always good. Lucas ate quietly and spoke when spoken to, and I watched him do the particular internal work of a man who has received significant information and is processing it with the seriousness it deserves. Nicole ate carefully. She did not say much, but at the end of the evening, when we were putting on coats, she touched my arm. She said, "Eleanor, I would like to come for Sunday dinner next week. Just me, without Lucas, if that is acceptable." I looked at her. I said, "It is acceptable." She said, "I want to talk. Properly, not about the document, about things that should have been said a long time ago." I said, "I will make the good coffee." She said, "Thank you." She left with Lucas. Emma hugged me again at the door. Emma said, 47 people, Grandma." I said, 47. She said, "You knew all of them by name." I said, "I knew all of them by what they had done." The names came easily after that. Ryan said, "Mrs. Brooks, that dock repair. I already looked into it. I think it needs new planking on the east side." I said, "Richard would have agreed with that assessment." Ryan said, "I'll take that as high praise." I said, "You should." I drove home in the October evening. The birthday that no one had called for until 4:17. The birthday that 43 other people had called for before noon. The birthday that had confirmed every allocation in a document signed 3 weeks earlier. I parked in my driveway. I sat for a moment. I thought about Richard. I thought, I am 63 years old, and I know exactly who is in my life and what they are worth, and I have written it down in a document that will outlast all of us. That is not a bad way to spend a birthday. It is the following Sunday. Nicole came for dinner. She arrived at noon. She brought flowers, not the obligatory kind, the kind someone chooses when they have been thinking about what to bring and have decided on something that means something. Lavender and white roses. The same flowers Emma had carried at her wedding. I put them in the tall glass vase on the kitchen table. We sat down. Nicole said, "I want to start at the beginning, not this year's beginning, the real beginning." I said, "Tell me." She talked for 40 minutes. I listened for 40 minutes. Not everything she said was comfortable. Not everything I said was comfortable either. Comfortable was not the point. The point was the conversation that should have happened 3 years ago and was happening now. At the end, she said, "Am I too late?" I looked at her. I said, "The document is reviewed annually, in December." She said, "That is 2 months away." I said, "Yes." She said, 2 months. I said, "Presence is not complicated, Nicole. It is simply consistent. It simply shows up. It does not require grand gestures. It requires Tuesday mornings and honest conversations and lavender in a glass vase on a Sunday in October." She looked at the flowers. She said, "I can do that." I said, "I know you can. The question is whether you will." She said, "I will." I looked at my daughter-in-law across the kitchen table, the woman who had tried 3 times to alter things that were not hers to alter, the woman who had brought lavender and white roses on a Sunday in October and asked for a real conversation. Both things true simultaneously. 63 years old, 47 names in a document, 1 birthday that told me everything I needed to know. The document is reviewed in December. 2 months is enough time. It is also not very much time at all. Leave me a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Has someone ever shown you through their absence who they actually were? Tell me what you did with that information. I read every single one. And if this story reached something in you today, subscribe. Because next week's story will stay with you too.